All right, beautiful. So how was that?
It was good. I felt awkward trying to do it, but it's awakening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when I just exercised and everything, so I'm like inflamed. But it's nice. It's nice to take that up, and it's cooling and opening.
What about the internal state?
The internal state.
Yeah.
Clear. That mint is like aromatic, right? It sort of tingles. Feels like you're opening up.
Beautiful. Well, that's a perfect way to start.
Yeah.
So welcome, Sean. Thanks for
you.
being here.
Thanks for having me.
Sean is a coworker, and he's someone that when I watch him work, I see a master at work. Because you're very impeccable with the way you conduct who you are as a person. Just based on the way you look at you, how you dress, how you do your hair, how you present, how you articulate, how you have your rituals and discipline. That makes you who you are, right? So, but we'll get there. I wanted to. This is a question I ask everyone, and that is, what are some of the pivotal moments that happen in your life that makes Sean McCarron the person that you are, the man that you are?
Wow, some pivotal things in my life. I don't know if I could identify specific moments, but I was raised in the Midwest by parents who grew up in New York City and Seattle, and so both of them felt like fish out of water, raising a family in the Midwest, and so I sort of took on that feeling of being raised in a culture that wasn't very much my own, and always sort of had that disposition that there was more out there that I didn't have access to, and I needed to go find.
This was in Seattle?
This was in the Midwest.
Midwest, I see.
Yeah, during my the end of grammar school and high school education was out there, and so fairly formative years, and when I think about why I am the way I am, I draw connections to that period in my life where I sort of took on some of the characteristics of Midwesterners, but that from my family's disposition, there was always a larger world out there that I needed to go see and experience for myself and needed to go be in.
So you had that inclination of exploration from a very, very young age. Hey, there's a bigger world out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that you carry that MO continuously throughout.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What others are there?
Others.
Pivotal moments that are.
Yeah, pivotal moments. I guess continuing on that theme, pivotal moments. When I went to college, throughout both high school and college, participated in long distance running, and long distance running was again that sort of an interesting dichotomy of participating in athletics, which is something that is fairly highly valued, broadly speaking, in our culture, but a particular kind of athletics that is actually kind of marginalized, right? This long distance running was not sort of football or basketball or baseball, and so in the Midwest, that was sort of an outsider within type of position to be in. And then moving into college, I think a lot of long distance runners, have that shared experience across the U.S. and so formed a very tight knit group of guys who you spend a lot of time with when you are training, and college being a formative part of your life as well. Spent a lot of time with a tight knit group of guys who all came from similar experiences within athletics of feeling like they wanted to accomplish something, that they were going to work hard, that they were this, that, or the other, but you don't have the same sort of cultural bravado of participating in an athletic sport that everybody lavishes attention on, right? Long distance running, it's really only like parents who, no one wants to come and watch those types of sporting events. And certainly when you are talking about racing over, a 3 or 4 mile span, you're not even running on a track, even that meager spectating aspect of it is concentrated in very small parts. So a lot of
you get a glimpse of like, hey,
exactly. And so a lot of the performance of your sport is solitary or not watched, right? I think not that the solitary aspect we can talk about, but I think the point that I would make here is that you're not watched, and so the performance of your sport is you're not used to doing it for an audience. And I think that shapes the kind of man you are, and especially the kind of man that still sees themselves as an athlete, as an athletic man. And so in college, forming a really tight-knit group, we were not a large team and we weren't a large school. And so spending sort of so much time with a group of guys like that, they were incredibly formative. And then, yeah.
I have a follow-up question there. So in Chinese, we have a phrase loosely translated. If I do a direct translation, that is, if you come to this world naked, you leave this world naked, basically by yourself, right? So, and it's ultimately, we are in this world, in this container of a body in our experience, in this container. So it's a very, if we can come to terms with that, the earlier the better, because then you're not codependent on another human being to help you feel a particular way. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, why did you pick this particular sport? Is it because of that? I don't know, maybe you're an introvert, maybe you're a solitary person just to begin with, or you did it because it suits your athletic capability?
Yeah, I actually was a gymnast, and then my mother is a very talented soccer player and coached youth soccer, coached our soccer teams for a lot of my youth. And my stepdad coached gymnastics. And so I really enjoyed those sports, but I ended up, when I was 9 or 10 or so, had a pretty decent fracture accident in gymnastics. And that injury I carried a fair amount of trauma from. It was a fairly bad accident, and
psychological.
Yeah, a lot of psychological trauma. Where I, as a kid, then sort of suffered quite a bit of anxiety and had troubles falling asleep. And when I, once the arm had healed and I had tried to go back to the sport, I could really not focus on the sport. All I could sort of see were how every move could go wrong, how every sort of, traumatic injury could be the end result of whatever I was doing. And that's a sport where you have to maintain laser focus, because if you don't, that is how you end up really hurt. And so I tried to go back for 6 months or maybe a year, and just I couldn't do it. Continued to play soccer, and then like a couple years later, I had a pretty bad arm fracture playing soccer, the other arm.
Oh man.
Yeah, and it was not funny, but it happened, and I knew exactly that it happened, and I basically like got up from the fall and walked off to the sideline and was like, "Mom, we need to go to the ER." I could feel it. I had just been through it a couple of years ago, and so from that, that was easier to go back to, because you're not doing, but I became a less, I was not as good of a player because I wasn't quite as aggressive. I wouldn't go in and win, the ball as much as I used to, because I sort of had this reservedness to the sport. And so from that, I started to run in high school, and really liked my coach in high school. He was, a really fantastic guy. And so in the sort of culture in my high school, we didn't have soccer as an actual sport. So you either played club soccer, but if you wanted to participate in the school's athletics in the fall, you either had football or you had cross country. And so I wasn't going to play football. So I signed up to play cross country or run cross country, and it went well. There's not as much contact, although I ended up getting injured running cross country as well. But I just started to focus on running. Continued to try and play club soccer, but like I said, I wasn't as good of a player. And then when you're trying to take long distance running as a sport seriously, which I had some initial success at it, and so wanted to keep doing it, even a sort of slight bruise or kind of a sore ankle or something that you might get from playing soccer on the weekend is going to translate into affecting how you can train for running. And so I kind of had to slowly just wean off of soccer and focus on long distance running.
So you're leaning into more and more kind of like process of elimination, and also leaning into being competitive. Like that warrior spirit is still strong within you. You want to compete on that very elite level, so you kept pushing it that way and then weaning off soccer.
Yeah.
Cool. And how did that college career as an athlete, long distance, shaped you as a person?
In a couple different ways. I mean, I think that some of the things that, because I entered college sort of very, one of the things that I had picked up in the Midwest was a sort of, I don't want to, I'm struggling to describe it in a value neutral way.
Go ahead and say
it. But it, the way that I would describe it for myself, I could say I picked it up from the Midwest, but the way that whatever it was, the way that it played out with me is it came off as a moral haughtiness. And there was, and that sort of came from lessons and values that I think were instilled in me explicitly, but also for a good reason. Like I had a cross country coach who in high school who worked in the ER and worked in physical therapy for ER, people who had suffered, had gone through the ER. And so he would, he wouldn't want any of us to ride motorcycles. He wouldn't want any of us to do these dangerous things that he saw result in, Iowa City was a college town. So he saw, a lot of basically people who he was coaching a few years later, in college, making all these, decisions that landed them in the ER. And so he was very much, you do things the right way. You don't drink. You don't do this. You don't do that. And so I sort of, took that, and especially as I started to gain a leadership role in high school, was then responsible for passing that on to the younger people. And so I entered college in this very sort of there's a right way and there's a wrong way to do everything.
Very absolute.
Yeah.
Black and white.
Yeah.
I see.
And I think that to try and return it to what you were asking about, with what it was about participating in the sport in college that was formative is, like I mentioned, I ended up being part of this close-knit group of guys who they at least didn't bring that in, right? They didn't bring in this sort of moral haughtiness or anything like that. In fact, they brought in, the first sort of opening of my world was, you can be silly, do fun things, live your life in a number of different ways that I thought were, from where I had come from, were no, that's incompatible with being disciplined, working hard, taking pride in your, work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they basically just blew it open and was like, wow, here are guys who, and a coach who, will do whatever they want, but they'll wake up in the morning and they will, pound the pavement, and, they will have that, so that discipline could sit, with no conflict in, all kinds of different people, that it wasn't like only puritanical people were successful at the sport, which was new for me, and sort of opened up, sort of cracked that moral haughtiness to a degree, and then sort of helped me dissect, recognize that there's a much greater flexibility in how we pull together traits and characteristics, and that there are some that don't necessarily have to go together, that you can be one thing and another thing, or I don't know, I don't want to be too vague, but just that that there's a million different ways to be a person, and the things that I would like to be don't have to come bundled or packaged with a whole bunch of other things, if that makes sense.
It does. And I wanted to actually highlight how I always admire how you can be very precise in navigating your value, your own internal world, and you can actually articulate it. And we talked about that privately, because not everyone can do that. A lot of people can say, yeah, roughly that direction, but if you ask, because I'm the kind of person who asks, like, what do you mean specific this? And most people really can't describe the nuance, but you can. So, wow, what a blessing to meet those guys.
Yeah.
Kind of open your world up to new
friends for life. Yeah.
Yeah. Are they really?
Mm-hmm.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's great. You kept in touch?
Oh yeah, I just saw one of them when I was in New York.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm terrible at doing that. I needed to be better at doing that. All right. So great. So. Anything more, the pivotal moments that kind of shaped you, who you are as a person, as a man?
Sure. So shortly after college, my final year in college, I had a brilliant professor who I adore and am still in touch with, who had this class that really sort of, again, the through thread would be this idea of that there's a larger world out there, that that sort of sense of adventure, or at least curiosity, if not adventure, where she taught this course called Religion in the Environment. And I was a religious studies major and moral philosophy major as part of a well-rounded candidacy for medical school.
Oh, so you weren't religious personally, but you wanted to get into medical school.
Yeah.
So you were being strategic about.
I was being fairly strategic. Yeah. So, well, I mean, I actually had a complicated relationship with religion. I mean, I was raised Catholic, and the Midwest is very religious. Pomona College is not, a religiously affiliated school. However, they do have a religious studies and philosophy department. But the approach to the academic discipline of religious studies is not religiously affiliated, right? It's bringing to bear all of the liberal arts and sciences to the subject of religion, and so. As I was learning that there were other ways of being in the world, and losing my moral haughtiness, but, also recognizing, it sounds a little bit trite, but just that, like you hear people say that, like, atheists, it doesn't, just because you're atheist doesn't mean you don't have morals. That kind of sort of like, it seems like a very simple thing, but I mean, I guess part of that flexibility in configuring characteristics that make up people, finding people that I was having much more genuine, honest connections with, and who I felt like cared about people, and religion had never been part of their upbringing and things like that. It just sort of expands your worldview. Anyway, so I wanted to go to med school. I was taking all the science classes, but Pomona College is a fantastic liberal arts school, and so I was feeling like I was doing my own education a disservice if I only took science classes. Plus, then they were also advocating well-rounded candidates, and so I was like, okay, I will major in something that's not, microbiology or something. And so, anyway, so the final year, this course, Religion and the Environment, and it focused a lot on some of the challenges of climate change and how we're treating our climate. And this was, this was before An Inconvenient Truth and everything. And that really again sort of sparked that outward perspective shift. I had my group of guys, I had been at college, everything had sort of been focused on that sort of immediate world. And then senior year, sort of looking at what was going to happen next, and taking this class that was, about all of these challenges that we're facing with the environment. I decided to, save. I had enough credits to graduate and everything, and so I actually dropped my status down to part-time so that I could save on tuition, and saved, half a year's of tuition, and took that money and went and tried to build off-the-grid sustainable homes in Ireland.
Kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
The world I didn't know about.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
I know. People are pretty surprised when they find out I have a massive hippie era of my past. But yeah, so the pivotal moment there, traveled, left the country after graduation, was living on my own with a college buddy, off the grid, trying to rehabilitate an old stone farmhouse in Ireland. And then, when he wanted to get back to the States, he left, a love interest who is now his wife, here, and wanted to get back. I wasn't quite ready to return to the States, and so I moved on to New Zealand and started, traveling and backpacking around New Zealand and volunteering on organic farms and stuff. And so that sort of whole section of living abroad and trying to do something that, some of it was to prove it to myself that I could do it. Some of it was to show other people that if somebody who they don't think of as being someone who would be able to handle doing something like that, that it would sort of be like, oh my gosh, if Sean can go, live in a house, or, go be a farmer, then certainly, I can recycle or something. And then, and it was traveling around down in New Zealand solo, for several months, that, I also, in that, I don't know, something about traveling solo and being in a foreign land really, a lot of people talk about what kind of experience that can be. And I really sort of came to terms with, things that I had been wrestling with myself, and internal demons and things that, I had been clenching onto and letting go, and sort of came out to myself in New Zealand. And so that was sort of a pivotal moment, because, then when I returned to the States, I felt just more comfortable and more like settled in who I was and how I wanted the rest of my life to go in terms of a relationship with myself. And so, yeah, and
so I see a few. I mean, so interesting to kind of learn the backstories of a person. So the through line that I saw was you start to kind of get this awareness that there's a bigger world when you met your friends, running buddies, and you became more rigorous about your internal world from the religious studies. And I also see a through line of like a balance between being like a risk-taking, strategic. Risk-taking as well as being strategic, like a good balance. So it's like the whole thing's coming together. I was like, oh, okay. So now I kind of see how Sean McCarron's the way he is. It's so cool. That's beautiful. So you mentioned that you were able to let go of, some of your, you call it internal demons and things like that. It's one of those things that it's so easy to say, right? You just let go. And one of my mentors would say, "I can't pee for you." And our suffering comes from the things that we grab onto. That reality is not perfect the way it is. It shouldn't be this way. So we hold on to this ideal of it should be this particular way or it shouldn't be this particular way. And it's hard to do just that, to let go of whatever our preconceived notion is. So are there like techniques or experiences that you had that really helped you let go, that you can repeat later on in life, or was it purely a accidental serendipity in the moment during your travels?
That's a really good question. I think from what you said, I think there's two. I would think about it at least in two categories. One is when reality doesn't conform to what you expect or want or desire, that can sort of be one motivation of holding on. And that I would feel conflicted about, because I think the experience of having want and desire is part and parcel of the whole thing. And so I'm not necessarily sure, gripping onto things like that is always bad. On the other hand, I think that there's this you're right, letting go is kind of a very flippant construction. But it's like when you can't do something, right? I mean, think about, flexibility, even if I don't necessarily want to touch my toes, there's things that I just can't do, because of where the situation is or where you are. And, I think realizing those limitations can just be uncomfortable because we don't like feeling limited. I would say that, you're right. Letting go is not a great way to describe it, because I was very, very conscious the entire time of how slow everything was going, right? Like I consistently have had the experience of like wanting to get to a certain state, whether it's like wanting to be okay with something, right? Like I wanted to get to some sort of state, whether it was acquiring a skill, whether it was super tactical, whether it was, emotional state, psychological state. And over and over and over again was confronted with this, like, I can't rush it. I simply can't, there's nothing in my power that can make this go faster. And so,
but you can make a woman pregnant faster by having 9 women.
Sure.
As an example.
Yeah, or just that. Just because I'm able to intellectually grasp, like, oh, I'm struggling with this issue, and I really need to let go, or blah blah blah. Like, even if I understand the things, sometimes the timing, like, I can't. Just knowing that isn't going to make me get there faster, or like. No, right. So if knowing exactly the kind of training that I need to do won't get me the improvement right away. It's actually the time. Literally the time has to transpire doing those things before you get there, right? You actually have to put in the time. And and I think that we always kind of like are looking for hacks, right? Or you're looking for, I was sort of very self-conscious that I wanted to learn from people's mistakes, right? I wanted to learn from their mistakes so that I could get ahead, or at least not have to, make the same mistakes. And I think that's helpful sometimes, but other times, you don't necessarily need to make their own mistakes. But sometimes people got to where they are because they've been through it.
The journey.
They've been through it. Yeah, they've been through the journey. And so there are things that I would sort of learn or like want to be okay with, or get over someone, or things like that. And it's like you can't rush it. And so letting go is sort of a mischaracterization, I think, of the experience. It's some of those pivotal moments were it is more of like a release, and that's where the letting go comes from, is that the somatically and psychologically, like experientially, it feels like a release, but I don't think you necessarily are aware that you were clenched before. And so instead of it being something that like you put down a heavy burden or something, it's more like when you're getting a massage and somebody just sort of like forces this relaxation, you know, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden, I didn't realize how tense I was. I just released. And so it's more of that, where it's like, over the course of time, it just happens, right? As opposed to, I had been carrying around this weight and finally put it down. And that, I think, that's not how it felt for me.
So let me actually recap a little bit. So what you're saying is, it wasn't anything that you were conscientious about, oh, I gotta let go of X. You know, this thing doesn't serve me anymore. It was more of the unknowing, the blind spot that you realize all of a sudden that you can transcend from it and have that release, that musculature, the somatic release that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think the blind spot. Yeah, I think that blind spot analogy is right, because you don't know, right? I mean, and in some of that, you know, unconscious clenching or holding on to things does stem from fear of an unknown, or even if it's not fear, but it's just unknown. I had no idea, you know. I had no idea that, you know, you could curse and swear and drink and still be a really good, honest person, right? Previously, until I met someone who was like that, you know, and it's like, you see it and you're just like, oh, what have I, you know, why have I been holding these, you know, sort of assumptions or judgments, or, you know, like, it's that you where you go, well, I think my life could be like this, or I think my life could be that, or I guess I'm just going to have to do X for the rest of my life. And it's like, until you sort of like have that realization that like, no, actually there are other possibilities out there. Then yeah, the world, yeah.
Hold that thought. I wanted to continue on that, but let's, are you willing to try a little hape? We'll edit this out, by the way, your reaction part.
Wow, thank you for sharing these with me. Totally new. I've never, that's very cool. All right.
Ready?
Yeah.
Amazing. So fast, the recovery.
Well, I mean, I can still feel it, you know, in my sinuses.
So, how was that?
That was more intense than the other one, but...
I mean, scale 1 to 10, 10 being the most intense, 0 being nothing.
Well, I feel, I mean, I'm totally new to this. So you have sort of that rush, right, of feeling it in your sinus, but then you sort of have this, like around the skull, like head feeling of, I understand now why you would describe it as like immediately post-workout, where you're sort of going, and then you get that like woo, right? Where you sort of let go. So you sort of have this intense, you know, fiery feeling in your sinus, but at the same time you have this like relaxation around the rest of like the back of the head.
What about the internal state?
I'm calming down as we speak.
I think that question of letting go is really worthy of discussing a little bit more, so I want to follow up a little bit. So this past weekend I was in ceremony, and I really got to see my own neurosis, these like nervous tics that I have. It's the unknown. Like I had no idea. I knew about it, but I wasn't in the forefront. But I actually got to watch everything, and then I realized it's from the conditioning from, like, say, parenting, culture, and then really the root of all of this is our survival instinct as animals, and that's just passed down for like 250,000 of years, right? And this lack of psychological safety, as an example, that had me just be like this like nervous tics.
Yeah.
And that prevents me from really achieving that inner stillness and also the external stillness as well. So when I feel like I'm like shaking my legs or I'm like twirling like this like fidget, I fidget. And then I just notice
fidget?
like,
You must have worked a lot, or you're very self-aware then, because I would not.
Right. So
I haven't observed you fidget.
Right. So see this like fidgeting. Right? So, which is interesting because it's this awareness is beautiful because it allows me to have tools or preparations or rituals, disciplines to call all of that stuff away. So every ceremony I take, I get to like do a little bit more. But this time I really got to see the core of this survival instinct as an animal. So, but this is about you. I wanted to focus on that. So for you, how do you, because you and I were alike in that way, we like things a particular way,
yes.
right? So I'm assuming you can relate. So how do you develop that awareness and to be free from that conditioning, whether it be parental, cultural, or even this like animalistic survival instinct, so you can truly be that spiritual being, right? Infinite being that you are, and choose the life that you wanted to live.
Yeah, I think we've spoken about some of these things before, and it's part of why I really enjoy having conversations with you, because I think we're drawn toward the same things. But one of the differences, I think, in our dispositions is so raised Catholic, and part of my expansion of understanding my own religiosity, I found in college, as I had let go some of the certain trappings of being raised Catholic, I was interrogating the ideas and the cosmologies and philosophies via my formal schoolwork. But I found that what I found most powerful about specifically, Catholic upbringing was ritual. And so I would still every so often on Friday nights go to the church not far from campus, because on Friday evenings they would host Eucharistic adoration. And
What's that?
It's a Catholic ritual where they put a consecrated host in this gorgeous, ornate, I'm sure there's a term for it, but it basically holds the host in sort of a clear, so you can see the host, but then there's a gold star burst around the host, and they set it out, and it's
Dinner host.
What's that?
Sorry, a host.
A wafer.
Okay.
Unleavened bread. It's about the size of a really large quarter, like a $50 or something. And they, so it sits there, and you have gold, big, beautiful, and it's unlike sort of like a chalice thing, right? So you got a big chalice, and it holds the host, and there's a big sunburst thing around it. It's a beautiful instrument. And they set it at the front of a chapel room, right? You're not in the main sort of celebratory mass area, but they set it on a small altar in a chapel, and then they'll have lighting on it, so it's just sort of glistening. It looks beautiful, and there's nobody in there. There's no priest. There's no ceremony. You just sit and you kneel in a pew, and it's silent, and you're just supposed to look you're just supposed to look at the host, and so you just sit and adore the Eucharist. And I would go and I would do that because it's something that I hadn't participated in growing up. I really would only go to Mass, and it was this ritual that you could have likened it to meditation. It was just like a silent time of prayer, and ritual, I think, is very important. I mean, it is the way that we construct not only our physical world, but our cosmological world. That is, one of the main powers of ritual. And I still am drawn to that. I think that the way that you describe this sort of, how do you excavate all of these trappings, these mortal trappings, and get in touch with being your spiritual being. What has been very, very inextricably tied for me in my whole experience of either being a runner and being very in touch with my physical body, having been raised in a very ritualistic type of religion, and then even as I've then explored the world of these types of experiences where you are helping produce a physical state that's supposed to bring you closer to a spiritual state. I like recognizing tics and things like that, but I have no interest in shedding them, if that makes sense. That it's very much, how would I describe this? A lot of sort of, at least Western interpretations of Eastern philosophy, and then even in Christian morality, right? This idea that this is our mortal coil, but we're actually a spiritual being. That this is the shell that we have for this time and place. I don't like rejecting that. I like saying, okay, then I am a being that is not only spiritual. I am a being that is incredibly human, and part of that being is having psychological safety tics, and having culture, and having these failings and these failures and these struggles and these capabilities, and the sort of the freeiness of playing with that experientiality with things like this, and it makes me come into contact and be aware of them, and then my response to that awareness is to fall in love with them, right? Because they it's like spreading out on a table all the cards that make up who you are, and it's not to necessarily scrape half the deck away. It's to lay it all out and go, isn't it joyful to recognize that I have this psychological tic? Because what greater evidence of being alive is there, right? So it actually makes me feel more alive, being able to survey them like that, as opposed to having them be unconscious. Helping bring them into your consciousness is like, oh, right, isn't it crazy that I have the idiosyncrasy? And if, hopefully when I'm aware of it, right, and I think it's inappropriate in a certain time, I'm not trying to rid myself of it. I can just go, not right now.
Yeah, I love that. I just got chills. Thank you so much. And really, that's what I was communicating. It's about, because what you resist persists. When you make something wrong, like, I'm this way, this shouldn't be this way, then the more you shouldn't be this way, then now it adds pressure, and then, kind of like a beach ball, right? The more you try to press it down, guess what? The more you let go, boom, it recoils. So absolutely, I'm very much in the same boat about embracing what makes us totally human, and to choose. I mean, ultimately, that's the key word, to choose. What is it that you want, the timing of it, and then whether or not you want to impose or share, right, necessarily these idiosyncrasies with people around you.
Yeah.
And then, because I'll share this about myself a little bit. I would unconsciously, share this with my wife, and then she hates it. But I really enjoyed it because this is my animalistic instinct, right? But now that I'm more aware of it, then I can say, all right, so for the good of our marriage, for our relationship, is this something that I wanted to do? And then the answer would be, well, no, because she doesn't like it, right, as an example. So I really so much appreciate how you articulate this. All right, good. So I want to change topic a little bit to more our ecosystem, our impact to other people. So then how do you, with all of this awareness of who you are as a human being, right, as well as a spiritual being, and how do you surround yourself with the type of people that will really empower you to live the life that you want? Who are your best friends, and why are they your best friends? I guess that would be probably the easier way to ask this question.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, a very difficult question as well. I think it becomes, I don't know, I think this is very difficult to articulate because it's difficult to identify any sort of causal relationship, right? Like that, or even origin. You know, it is still a bit of mystery on like how this works. But the phrase that immediately comes to mind is judgment of character, and I mean that not in a way that's tied to these things like, oh, do you possess the right configuration of personality traits, or do you behave in the way that is what I think is right, but more like if the state of the world, right, and if the state of being human, right, encompasses all these things that I experience within myself, if I assume that others are also human beings with all of these complexities and operate in that way, do I see all of that taken together? Are they coming from places of like love, or are they coming from places of positivity, or are they destructive? And like, I don't want to essentialize it, right? I don't want to say that you have some sort of like ontological category, like there are good people or bad people in the world, and that's just, but I think that you can tell when people are just being who they are, and you can tell when people are like being actively nasty, if that's, or like are active. I struggle to articulate this. I feel like the people who I'm drawn to are people who, even if subconsciously, have this inkling of like, you know, that there's a complexity to who we are, that are open to, you know, people being different, right? Like, I don't know. This is really hard.
Yeah, I know it's challenging. I don't have an answer here either.
Yeah,
we're inquiring about this together.
Yeah. I come off with the like judgment of good character because I think that there's, I mean, I had a professor once say that, and so I do sort of think about it in this fuzzy of a way, where he said, it really profoundly affects the way you are in the world if you believe that the universe is out to get you, or if the universe is a wonderful place to be, right? And so like, it's less sort of, you know, what happens to you or what are people doing, and I think that if, you know, when I encounter people and they seem to be coming from a place of the universe is a wonderful place to be, they feel, you know, they feel safer for me to be with. They feel like I can deal with whatever, you know. They can still be, you know, short-tempered, or they might be, you know, right, trying to compete for the same thing I'm competing for or whatnot. But like, if I can recognize that they are fundamentally coming from a place where the universe is a great place to be, as opposed to the universe is out to get me. Because if the universe is sort of, you know, the school of hard knocks, like it's coming out to get you, then that competition becomes, I'm going to get mine.
Zero-sum game.
Yeah, the zero-sum game. And I think that people who sort of come from a place of, even if it's not conscious, if they seem to be operating in a world where everything is a zero-sum game, that's not something I want to be around, because it means one of us has to lose. In any aspect, right? Whether it's work or a relationship, or you know, if there has to be a winner or a loser.
There's a framework. I'm summarizing this. There's like different grades of consciousness. One would be the things life is happening to me,
right?
And then there's I am accountable, responsible for my life, and then there is life happening for me, and then there's life happening through me, like a channel, right? I think you were speaking more about like the life happening to me, and then like zero-sum games, and therefore I need to, you know, compete and versus life happening for me in the third level. Using that framework as a way to kind of think about it. Is that kind of accurate what you were discussing?
Yeah, and the end being the life through, that we're in this together, that life is both happening through us.
Beautiful. So in terms of how do you balance, I'm going to go back to the self just a little bit because I know that we've covered our people around us. How do you balance between this desire of like the human, the ego wanting to be self-indulgent, and then the other part be, hey, we're all in this together. And then there's a line somewhere, right? Because it's easy, right? Using, once again, myself as an example, easy to be self-indulgent and say, hey, my relationship with my wife, she's not doing the thing that I want, therefore, not a good relationship, as an example.
Yeah.
Or versus, hey, we're a team, we're all in this together. Her happiness is my happiness, we're coalesce together. So how do you, where is the line between this self-indulgent, the sovereignty, right, base versus the collective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I continue to struggle with. And not to bring astrology into it, but I mean, so I'm a Leo, which, a Leo is stereotypically prideful, likes to be the center of attention, could very much be described as a strong ego. But the other side of a Leo is that the ego, the point of the ego for a Leo is to, it's a sun sign, is to share and light, it's to share light and warmth and, right, it's to be energizing. And so, cynically or less flatteringly, the Leo is kind of like that kingly lion, where it's, as long as you are satisfying the ego of the Leo, they shower you in gifts and love and attention, and and that there's a benefit to that ego, and so I guess I would start from describing it in those terms, where to connect what we were just talking about with that is, if the indulgence of that ego has a positive effect, right? If the indulgence of the ego means that you are able to spread, more goodness for all those that are indulging in the ego, it seems less problematic for me, I guess. But then you'd have to ask people who interact with me, I suppose. But I think that if you see, the life is happening through me, and you're aligning, your experience of what your ego wants as that, then I don't necessarily think it's such a bad thing. I mean, when it comes to a more grounded experience, like, well, I want this thing to happen, this other person doesn't want it to or wants to see it differently, and so how do you resolve that? I think it's more, that collective is like, okay, well, if we are operating under the assumption that the universe is not a zero-sum game, let's figure out what is it that your ego wants, what is it that my ego wants, and there is a solution where both of us win, right? There is some, if applied, analyzed, and addressed strategically, we can have everybody win. And so, like in my relationship, when we have those sort of conflicts where it's like, okay, your ego has been a little bit out of control, or your ego has, the indulgence of your ego has now led to this situation that we would like to rectify because something's out of alignment, or I'm sick of it, or it's, not the right timing. I mean, it's that, give and take and negotiation of like, okay, well what are, let's put our wants on the table so that we can pick the best arrangements to get maximize all the wants. I guess that just slipped into utilitarian type thinking, but
Right. Optimize, right?
optimize.
Yeah,
yeah.
make it optimal, not
Yeah.
necessarily maximize per se, but optimal, right? That's what I hear.
Yeah, and you can redirect forces. I mean, I think if you're open, if you're open to things being defined in a number of different ways, I mean, it can be a realignment of where that ego energy is. What I thought that I want, what I thought my ego wanted, or the satisfaction of my ego was, in option A here. I didn't realize that there was option B over here that was going to satisfy my ego as well, but not be as, difficult for someone else.
So I'm actually curious. Because you and I would have very intellectual conversations, right? Very like metaphysical. Like we navigate different nooks and crannies of our mind. Do you have this conversation with your significant other? Similar type style?
Similar type style?
Where you talked about, hey, this thing don't serve me, put it on the table, like let's compare and contrast and optimize, or may come up with an optimal solution, like in a very clear way like this?
Not super often, but we actually, we do this sort of like emotional excavation, right?
I like that. I like that.
Yeah, emotional archaeology.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, where we do sort of say, and most of the time it's after the fact, right? Or not after the fact, but like we discuss things in the past that are like, oh, I wonder if this is because I was feeling that way, or and so we do have conversations like that.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Now, do you feel like if more couples do that, because there's a few schools of thought, right? One school of thought is let's do that unfacilitated, just two people.
Yeah.
Right? Or I don't know, if you're into polyamorous, then it gets multiple people together.
Yeah.
Another one would be facilitated. Have a neutral party, a therapist, whatever, a friend who can be the arbitrator, right? All this. What's your take on the actual process?
Yeah.
To really build a beautiful, successful relationship together.
I mean, I think it kind of depends on. It depends on the emotional dynamic that the two of you create. Some people, I think, create a very strong and intense and sometimes volatile emotional chemistry, and in those situations, I feel like having those conversations are good, but are probably like more tension filled, or maybe characterized a bit more by conflict. In which case, it may be better to have a third or neutral party help mediate. But I mean, to give you a concrete example that happened just a couple of days ago, we had a conversation and there was no sort of there wasn't like some need that brought this conversation out. It was simply just kind of a bit how I am, because I just like talking about this stuff. But we had a conversation about, some of it was that, I've been very preoccupied with work. I've poured myself into work. Work can be emotionally draining and sort of demanding for me. And that leads to having less energy when I come home to be able to help maintain the household, right? So simple sort of things like, errands and whatnot. And he was acknowledging that I have not been present there, right? And understands where it comes from. And, we ended up talking about the difference between, and discussing what the relative balance is between these two things, discussing the difference between bringing somebody happiness and making somebody happy.
Right. I like that.
And
it's a really good point. Say more about that, please. I
Yeah.
think the listeners really appreciate this.
Sure. It might be flipped around in other people's minds, but for me, I think of making somebody happy as make. I don't think of make as a synonym for create. I think of make as make. I think is actually, at least in the romantic languages, is a state of being verb. So make is actually a state. It's not like create. Whereas I think of bring is a verb that's connotates labor. You're carrying, you're bringing, you're moving something from one thing to the other. Whereas make is more of, that state of being. And so making somebody happy, in my mind, is who I am or what I do or what I, like the experience of me causes a state in you. You are happy because of whatever it is that I am, you're happy.
Your way of being.
I'm making you happy. My way of being creates happiness in you, right? It's an altered state, right? Whereas bringing happiness is things that I know that you love. I'm going to make that. I'm going to bring that to you, right?
It's
I'm going to bring you happiness.
The doing rather than the being.
Yeah.
Is that what you're? Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So things that where the source of the happiness might be elsewhere.
Let's change gear a little bit.
Sure.
Because you're a marketer, and we talk a lot about narratives. In my mind, it's all about like narratives. I think to have a really successful, beautiful life is the story we tell ourselves, right? Whether the universe is happening through us, for us, like this is all narratives. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that's what a marketer's job is, to tell powerful stories, right? So from your perspective, how can you use the mechanics of marketing as a way to really empower people to tell powerful stories about themselves, about their work, about society in large? Because I think ultimately, if we can tell powerful stories, let me simplify it further, grossly simplify this. Whoever can tell the most powerful story wins. And by winning, I mean like last, hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years. Religion is a very powerful story that people have been telling. For commerce is a very powerful story that people have been telling, right? Tribes, tribalism, family, all of this, these are powerful stories that we tell ourselves. Science, potentially, right? We can also argue using this framework as a powerful story, although evidence-based, right? So how do you use marketing as a way to help people tell powerful stories about themselves, about the nature of work, about our society at large, about human beings in general? This is a big question.
I was going to say, that's crazy. I have no idea. I have no idea how I would answer this. Yeah. I think, well, part of telling stories, I don't know. There's so much out there on, from all angles, trying to understand why narrative is so compelling. And I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that I would have much to add there. I think it's very difficult to tell a compelling story if you don't deeply understand your audience, because a compelling story is a worldview that feels right, for lack of a better word.
The receiver's point of view.
Yeah. And so, if you the farther away you want to, the more you want to change somebody's worldview, the better you need to know every aspect of why their current worldview is so compelling for them, and then craft from that, in almost like decoupage, right? Like you're
What's that?
Taking bits and pieces of that current worldview and assembling a new worldview, that you can't sort of. And in business, right? Like there's case studies around this where you can't tell a radical story. You can't introduce too innovative, disruptive, right, of a product that causes too much of a break in in how we understand and interact with the world, right? So it's incrementality. And we can drum it up with fanfare and say that this incrementality is actually a much larger thing. But I mean, it has to evolve, right? The story has to evolve. You can't just come in with a brand new story. And I think that evolution is that you understand how somebody perceives the world working and why they're drawn to certain explanations of it, and you just slightly shift it, right? And you slightly and you say, okay, you thought that the really important aspects of the story were A, B, and C, but what if we said that A, B, and C don't matter as much as X, Y, and Z, which were part of the original story, but you just didn't pay attention to them? What if we, right? And it's more sort of opening people to things that they already know, or at least, they recognize, right? But you reconfigure attention, salience, right? You reconfigure which elements are salient, and you try and shift attached meanings. I mean, there's so many. The conceptual toolkit for trying to understand narrative, at least even just within social science, is massive. So I mean, I don't know if that's sort of what you're getting at when you are asking about the mechanics of storytelling.
No, not necessarily the mechanics per se. And this is something that I'm thinking about, because I'm seeing in my mind, again, grossly simplification of the world, is there's a part of the world that's, like a better word, being displaced, right, per se. People are nostalgic about the past, right? They want things to be more stable, and therefore they worry a lot about how fast things are moving. Maybe their jobs are gone because of technology or internationalization, globalization, etc. So they are now leaning more towards the strongman, right? Hey, this guy said we can bring back the glory of olden days. And there is a new group of people who is, very much the innovators, the technologists, the people who will say, hey, the world is abundant and right? And let's share more of the world. And then we're seeing things politically swinging back and forth, now leaning towards the strongman, right? But even though technology is having a mind of its own, so to speak, it's going to, in the very near future, displace a lot of jobs, right? Potentially like drivers and all these other things. It's a compelling, the tale of two stories, right? Now, so how do we, as technologists, people in the marketing world, how do we create a solution, tell better stories, such that we can, bring people together rather than see this bifurcation of me against this other group? And it's very, very philosophical in nature, so I don't really have a better way to concretize this more, but this is the thing that I'm seeing from my worldview. And obviously stories have layers too, right? So I think that there's the stories that we explicitly try and tell. There's also the stories, right, that are implicit around, implicit and explicit, but form cultural behaviors within the industries of storytellers, right? So you have a media industry that understands the world working in a certain way, and so they think they need to tell certain kinds of stories. You have the same sort of thing in technology, right? You have this culture of like the lone entrepreneur, and you have this idea of genius or disruption or what have you, right? And so there's all these sort of cultural narratives that are peculiar to particular industries that you then see actually limit us in how we're able to address certain challenges, like you're mentioning, or even what we seem as the realm of possible, right? Like something
something that we spend a lot of intro classes to sociology trying to teach students is to cultivate a sociological imagination. And what that means is thinking about what if the social world was not as it were, right? And the institution, broadly defined as a patterned set of arrangements with the resources to reinforce those arrangements, that can broadly apply to company, family, government, right? Institution is sort of the primary unit potentially of analysis. That creates a story, right? The way that those social relations, those arrangements are patterned, limits the way that you think of what is possible. And so part of cultivating a sociological imagination is saying, imagine other patterns of arrangement. And so imagine if technology disruption wasn't predicated on serving a particular economic class, or what if we didn't see this story of populism as one that's primarily fueled by racism and bigotry and and this nostalgia for the past. What if we understood that populism is actually one of the greatest sources of feelings of solidarity across races and across classes, right? And look at those examples. And so how might we better understand or differently understand what is happening, what our challenges are, and how might that mean that a media industry or technology industry would tell different stories. There's a lot of discussion around disruption, and disruption is sort of this very positive thing. And what if we shifted a narrative where we saw disruption as an incredibly destructive thing and not always for the better, right? How might we be thinking about the products and innovations we'd like to build, or the existing challenges we'd like to resolve, right? That we see that are the sort of primary motivation for disruption, right? We see something that we think is not great and we want to disrupt it.
Or make it more efficient, more effective.
Yeah.
In whatever way, through technology or otherwise. Yeah.
What if we had this idea that disruption is this fraught, negative thing, where we start to view innovation with this foresight of like, okay, well, what do we want to keep and what do we want to get rid of, right? Instead of this sort of like born again type of narrative, right? Where we're like from the ashes or from nothing, right? Which you see in a lot of, like, I mean, for example, the rollout of some of our last mile mobility solutions in Los Angeles, right? This way of rushing to innovation and saying that you're just disrupting something and focusing on, well, I've delivered this value, and that in and of itself is an inherent good, as opposed to you are purposefully trying to shift the patterned set of arrangements. In what way, right? In what way? Who is this actually helping, and who might this be harming? I saw something I read the other day that I thought was really funny. They said that they were surprised at the rapid shift in narrative from understanding social networks as, the narrative is going from connecting the world and making everyone in one spot is, like this open community,
helping
right?
the world to be more open.
Helping the world connecting the world makes the world more open. That sort of narrative, like how quickly it's shifted to, oh my gosh, of course, why would you not have thought that connecting the whole world might lead to like the amplification of a ton of things that we didn't necessarily want to connect, right? That kind of rapid shift in the narrative is, I think, goes to your point about like the power of storytelling, but I think stems from understanding what those underlying patterned set of arrangements are, and how are you actively reconfiguring them? And are you reconfiguring them in ways that the people you're telling the story to, do they see something? It's going to be more compelling when you are sort of I don't want to say honest, because that seems like it seems like a platitude, but like if I'm actively reconfiguring a pattern set of arrangements and then I tell a story that aligns fairly truthfully with how those pattern set of arrangements are changing, people will find that more compelling, right? And I think that if you step away from, if you try and address that with a bit more value neutrality, right, and instead of saying, well, I'm going to try and keep you from noticing that I've reconfigured this pattern set of arrangement in a way that actually is kind of crap for you. If I struggle to say, well, I'm going to tell an honest story about that, which means it puts the onus on me as a storyteller to really think about, well, why would somebody I'm telling this story to think that that's a good story as opposed to a bad story, right? Like if I'm saying, hey, I'm going to develop a bunch of autonomous trucks that are going to be able to replace, a major portion of American logistics, and I need to basically tell a story about how we're not going to talk about job loss, we're just going to talk about job value. It's like, well, but you've reconfigured that pattern set of arrangement. It's like you're not going to people are not going to find the story super compelling if you don't talk about this major aspect of it. If I go, wow, we're really reconfiguring the pattern set of arrangements whereby, the way that, things have been done to date are significantly changing. Like if I grapple with that as a storyteller, I now then not only think about, well, where would the opportunity then be to the people that I'm telling that story to? Not just the investor who's going to realize the value. How do I get a trucker to see that reconfiguration in a positive light? And if I struggle as a storyteller to think through that, I'll actually probably come up with ideas and suggestions that I can incorporate in our innovation that make that disruption ultimately better.
I really love that, actually. So I don't know what's the proper word for that. It's the onus, I don't know if that's the word, of the storyteller to really grapple with that and have some proposed solutions perhaps, versus just like, here's what it is. This is the great new widget. It's going to disrupt the industry, and sorry for the people that are gonna have some job loss. You figure it out yourself. But like, hey, here's some examples. We have, I don't know, training program, this and that, to help them adapt to this new technology. Potentially, it would be a more compelling narrative. One of my intentions is to lead people who are listening to this with tactical things, right? So they can actually not just be inspired by your narrative, but also take on or try on some new disciplines, new tactical things. So if there's anything that you can lead people who are still listening to this about how to live a more beautiful life, tell more powerful narratives, or to themselves, to their family, to their work, to society as a whole, or spirituality, perhaps, what would be one thing that you want to leave them with?
I'm trying to think of something that doesn't sound trite, but yeah, I mean, for me, even when I struggle the most or feel least prepared to least prepared to like handle anything. I just try and remind myself that it's kind of a back against the wall type of mentality if I really think about it, but that there's no point in doing any of this, and by this I mean like the human charade, like being here, being alive, like if we're not going to do it for generosity, and be like, I guess the world doesn't need another asshole, so like if you're going to be an asshole, then like what are you doing here? if you're going to be here, why not be here for, generosity? And in that, it kind of helps me take a step back and just, and sometimes I can't, right? Like, I think also, if we're just going to stack trite phrases on top of each other, like the this too shall pass type of thing, where it's just like, okay, I'm not able to deal right now. Why don't you like tap out and make sure that you plug back in when you are able to deal? And and like, yeah, just trying to make sure that your impact on other people is through generosity, because otherwise, like, no impact, I don't know, I don't want to say no impact is better than a bad impact, but you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like, hey, if you can't be here and sort of deal with stuff right now, like, take a break and let time pass, because things change. And then if you recognize that that your consequences, that your actions have had, really crap consequences for somebody else, try and dial back in and figure out how to rectify that. That sounds incredibly like throw pillow.
Well, let me actually follow up with something a little bit more, right? So as a discipline,
yeah.
Say I'm down for that.
Yeah.
Totally wanted to do it.
Yeah.
More generous person, right?
Yeah.
How do I actualize that? How do I operationalize that?
Yeah.
What would be the few things that you can recommend if someone who is perhaps new at being generous?
Yeah.
How do they be more generous?
I mean, I think I don't know how I would recommend to other people. I think it does differ. I mean, if someone can be satisfied with meditation practice, I mean, I think you find a ritual. It doesn't matter what that different rituals are gonna draw you in or seem like charades, depending on your own sort of like cultural toolkit. But I think finding some sort of ritual that makes you just confront yourself and your reality, as honestly as possible. I mean, some of that for me in the past has been through rituals like a Eucharistic adoration. Some of that in the past has been by visiting altered states, and being able to really do that sort of like interrogation of the self, and forcing, and like, whatever you're sort of, don't be afraid of like a dark night of the soul. And if you can sort of draw regularly upon those dark nights of the soul,
what's that? Just for the people who are listening.
Sure. I think of that as kind of when some of like the artifice is stripped away, or just like when you like, I've had actually good friends of mine, who don't, who are very uncomfortable with staring into the things that they feel really shitty about, and I think that it's just so incredibly important to be comfortable staring into things that you feel shitty about, and like getting to a place where you're like okay with that, in a sense that you're not going to avoid it, right? But maybe you're not okay with it in a sense that you want to change things, but like being comfortable with like, oh man, I feel really awful about this thing, and like sitting with that feeling of feeling awful, like being comfortable sort of staring into that abyss, visiting that dark night of the soul, like where you're just sort of sitting there and like, I really hate this about myself, and like I'm not gonna possess or like hold on to that hate, but like I'm also not gonna pretend that it doesn't exist. Like I'm gonna stare at it honestly in the mirror, or like I really hate that the world is this way, and you're gonna stare at it, and like really experience that like feeling of ugh. You know what I mean? Like,
I do know what you mean, exactly. And it's such a nuanced thing too, because going back to what we were just talking about earlier, it's about being with it but not being self-indulgent at it.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to be self-indulgent in that self-hatred or whatever, that negative feeling, and that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
We're talking about just sitting with it and letting it pass through you.
Yeah.
Like just being with it and being okay with that feeling.
Yeah.
That's what you mean, right?
Yeah.
I want to make sure I capture that.
Yeah. And to go all the way back, you know, to feeling like, hey, I'm not a spiritual being who's trying to escape my mortal being. Like, I am my mortal being, and that means I have the entire, you know, myriad endocrine system full of all the different chemicals that are creating whatever sort of emotions, you know, that I feel, and like that is part of actually who I am. And you know, if I feel things, like I feel things, and I don't want to, you know, if the spectrum of human experience is this huge broad spectrum, why would you try and only live in one? You know, why would you try and limit yourself to only being in one?
Thank you so much. Any lasting thoughts?
Thank you so much for this experience. This was great chatting.
Yeah, thank you so much for your generosity.
Thank you. Thank you, CK.